of my previous two-part documentaries series videos that go with a larger four-part series, which is what will be the entire series by the time this is all compiled. I am doing this for more of the replay value than the actual live stream itself. I'm just doing it as a live because I can fit a lot more into a live. I'm doing this as a live because I can fit a lot more into a live than I can in shorter videos like I did with past documentaries. Now, this is the part 3, and this is picking up from the part 2 and part 1s, which are all in the playlist about the internal civil conflict documentary, Syrian style. Hey, baby. Hey, Jennifer. Kisses. But, I am doing this because I want to continue with the map battles. This is like a low-budget History Channel presentation, more or less. And the part 3 is picking up from the battles that occurred during the last video, where you saw the battles that took place in Maine. These all occurred after the coup on the main line between regime and Maine forces. You also saw the battle that took place in Yakima, which is here in Washington, and the other large battle that occurred here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, wherein the Mormon State and NSRF faction were competing over the nuclear weapons there at Warren Air Force Base. Now, the background of this is essentially this. Various factions had arisen amid all of the turmoil and civil unrest that had been going on in the nation. Various factions consisted of various types of leadership corps, and in some cases, it was the actual state governments or elements thereof, of like Texas and also Florida. But there were leadership corps of the ultra-nationalist National Salvation Revolutionary Front, whose primary AO, or original headquarters area of operation, was here in the upper central Midwest, but it spread as far west into parts of Montana and Wyoming, and as far east as parts of Virginia, North Carolina, and even Kentucky here, and even little portions of Ohio, but and also as far south as to the Gulf of Mexico, such as here in parts of Mississippi and parts of Alabama. They had all jockeyed and competed for territory as they arose. Now, you also had factions such as the Free American Army faction, here in the lighter green, which conducted a coup against the regime in the capital here, and they had tried to install again the Constitution, the original Constitution. But their coup failed, and the globalist regime managed to cling on to power by a thread, by a single thread. And the coup forces took what prisoners they could, mostly high-ranking department heads, some politicians, as well as some high-ranking officers from the Joint Chiefs, and they fled to friendly areas where there were other friendly American forces that had joined their faction as soon as the message of the coup had spread across the military. Also, the coup that the NSRF conducted was also done by an amalgamation of rogue military units, mostly Guard and Reserve, but also hundreds of thousands of alt-right and ultra-nationalist militias, as well as former conservatives that turned ultra-nationalist and joined their cause, biker gangs and hackers and violent anarchists and other types of radicals, all amalgamated and seized power for the NSRF in this area. They were spurred on by very, very large, albeit underground, immensely sizable propaganda networks, such as the pirate radio station known as NSRF Radio, or National Salvation Revolutionary Front Radio, which was Alfred Motufu's radio station. He had a degree in communications and media, and he also knew the inner workings of the CIA Mockingbird media program of the CIA. And he flipped it all on its head and came up with his own psyops to steer all the various movements into the one singular direction of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, which had its own ultra-nationalist agenda among its leadership core. But the most radical of its leadership core consisted of a trio, a triumvirate, or a group of three, namely the three leaders of the coup that occurred among the NSRF. They were Colonel McGregor, a former Green Beret commander, a colonel rather, and he was essentially the Troika's military leader who coordinated and planned all military actions, and he even coordinated all the activities within the Troika itself, the ruling three of this faction. He was their head military leader, as stated. He, in coordinating the activities of the Troika, he was often the go-between between Professor Albertson, sorry, the cat, between Professor Albertson and also Alfred Motufu himself, who ran the propaganda network of the NSRF. He was also the policy head and it's essentially its leading politician, its political figure. So he was, in a sense, the political leader. He was also the paramilitary leader who organized all the death squads into the singular unit element called the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, which was an element of some 200,000 that organized. They were the most fanatical and radical of all the NSRF forces. Now, the regular forces of the NSRF consisted largely of militia forces and also core forces, which were the defecting military units and combat veterans of prior wars that amalgamated into the core forces of the NSRF, led specifically by Colonel McGregor. But the paramilitary forces were led by Alfred Motufu. And the prison network was led by Professor Albertson, as well as him being the economic and logistical commander of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front within the Troika. So you had all these leaders organizing within this faction and ending up purging much of the leadership core of the NSRF, purging its leadership that had cold feet, I'll just put it, because they only needed the most radical and they only desired the most radical of the leadership to stay. You had them spreading leaflets across the land, spreading leaflets. Alfred Motufu's radio station was relayed via cassette tape recordings of his shows, of his PSYOP programs, also being spread via ham radio operators, as ham radios themselves and their operators also played a gargantuan role in the spread of these factions seizing vast swathes of territory, used by the Mormon State, the NSRF, Texas, Florida, the Army of the Southeast, and even the Union of Southwestern Militias and the Northwest Conservative Army itself. The amalgamation or the confederation of the forces of the Raza Narc0 State didn't so much depend on ham radios, as they already had established forces coming in from Latin America that were already organized prior to the coups occurring, the large coup in the capital conducted by the junta of what became the Free American Army, which a junta is a group of officers that became the Free American Army and led that faction. Upon the failure of their coup, And upon the success of the NSRF coup, which seized large swathes of the north-central Midwest, and the church coup done by the Mormon State, and the seizure of their new capital in, what's that city? Sorry, y'all. Sorry, a cat threw me off. In Reno, they seized and established Reno as their capital for their Union of Southwestern Militias. The capital of the Northwest Conservative Army remained where it started in the initiation of hostilities in the city of Baker City here in the northeast corner of Oregon. They had become allies together and often coordinated their offensive against the regime forces, while even having limited offensives against the Free American Army, such as in the city of Las Vegas, and also, of course, the Union of Southwest Militias having to keep Mormon State off their backs because the Mormon State slightly encroached into parts of Nevada in the far eastern portions. But being that the terrain there was the Great Basin Desert and generally highly inhospitable for the logistical abilities of large formations, it was generally a stagnated front, as the logistics were limited to what small towns could provide insofar as food, water, which would only be enough to sustain very small battalion-sized or company-sized elements, if that. So the combat in this area remained generally small. In the beginning of the Mormon State, the church coup occurred, led primarily by these three acolytes of the Supreme Council of Elders, which the Supreme Council of Elders, the Council of Elders, was headed by Supreme Acolyte Josiah, right here in the middle, with his right-hand man, Grand Acolyte Mordecai, who was his commander of all Mormon State military forces, which made him second down the chain of command after Supreme Acolyte Josiah here. Grand Acolyte Mordecai was often referred to as the deputy or Grand Acolyte, and his title was Commander of the Faithful, since he was the commander of all the Mormon State's military forces. Integral in the church coup was Acolyte Issachar, who himself was a part of the Council of Elders, and he ended up raising up the Brigham Young Brigade, and then he was transferred to command the Called by the Faith foreign volunteer forces as their numbers began to swell, as they began to enter Mormon State territory through the Mexican border with the U.S., where the Mormon State had expanded into New Mexico in a southbound direction, and a small sliver of Arizona, similar to what they had done in Nevada. Other parts of the country were also undergoing their own turmoil at the very beginning of the conflict. This has just been a general review of what occurred. Now, there was a state coup in Texas where the part of the Texas government essentially overpowered the pro-regime part and installed an interim president to be the Texas president. While in Florida, essentially the entire Florida government had misgivings about the regime and the direction it was going, and decided to find their humanity after realizing that the globalist regime, when finished with them after they have served their purpose, was going to do away with them, which made them change their minds, and they decided to be on the right side of history and do the right thing and flip the tables on the regime, which they did do, and they managed to do so mostly successfully, minus the slivers of regime control, one such being the major city of Jacksonville, and the other being around the Daytona Beach area here. The Army of the Southeast was aligned with Florida, but also by default with Texas, as the three forces had formed an alliance against the regime against the Free American Army, and Texas a de facto against the NSRF, since they were also at war with Florida and the Army of the Southeast. Texas kept Florida alive by trade of its limited oil production capacity. It sent them some of that oil, just enough to keep them going, as Florida began the war with very, very small oil reserves, namely only 5% of the oil available throughout the entire nation, which was only some 42 million barrels. Very, very small quantity of oil overall. Texas, on the other hand, had a modest 22% size of oil reserves in the nation throughout the war, and they had 185 million barrels throughout the course of the war. And they were able to supply Florida with a fairly decent size out of that number in return for food and certain key weapon systems that they felt were necessary and needed. As for the Maine militia, they were a small force compiled of the local National Guard, some of the local reservists, who brought all their weapons with them and amalgamated with local militias such as the Three Percenters, who all came together to form a single militia force called the Maine Militia. And their main objective was to keep the regime from expanding and conquering Maine and integrating Maine into their northeastern zone of command, being that Maine largely had been ideologically opposed to the regime and its pro-globalist policies and its elitist policies of the Western satanic banking elites. So, without further ado, the next battle map will be the Battle of Macon. Macon was a key road juncture with a lot of strategic significance. During this battle, it occurred between July the 10th and August the 29th. This was a very long and drawn-out battle, occurring over the course of nearly 2 months. Total forces involved were, on the three-sided battle, the Army of the Southeast had some 35,000 troops, the regime 20,000, and the Free American Army 22,000. Regime forces were mostly comprised out of the forces coming out of Fort Stewart, Georgia, on their very limited fuel, sought to capture the key crossroads of Macon, not just to establish or reestablish regime control, but also to prevent the Army of the Southeast from having a land bridge connecting both its territories, and also to prevent the Free American Army from seizing the crossroads and thus being able to launch a effective counterattack and end up seizing Fort Stewart and Savannah, a city and an installation that were occupied by the regime at the time. Also at this battle, the 74th Squadron, which was an A-10 Warthog squadron, defected from Valdosta at the Moody Air Force Base to the Free American Army. And 2 A-10s were actually able to participate in the battle due to there being just enough fuel for one mission. The total casualties at this battle: the Army of the Southeast suffered 5,000 casualties and 4,000 POWs captured by the regime and the Free American Army factions. The regime's casualties were 7,000 casualties and 3,000 regime POWs captured between the two other factions, the Army of the Southeast and Free American Army. And the Free American Army, 4,000 casualties of theirs and 800 of their soldiers taken POW. Without further ado, we go to the battle map. Now, when the battle began, you can see that the regime forces were advancing up Interstate 16 here from the Savannah area to the east. Now, I-16 kind of weaves and bobs, but it heads in a general easterly direction from Macon. And you can see that their forces were comprised of largely military forces and paramilitary, with a small contingent of foreign volunteer battalions, which were basically refugees that the regime recruited out of the refugee centers that it ran, and also the woke militias, such as the BLM battalions and the Antifa battalions present at this battle. They were not very combat effective units, to be said for sure, but they did contribute as filler units trying to hold portions of the battle lines. These are the regime forces. Now, the Free American Army forces over to the west consisted of the 48th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which actually is largely a local force. It was actually called the Macon Volunteers, in quotes. That's actually what this unit's actually called for real. And they are a National Guard unit. They are largely a mechanized unit of mechanized infantry with a cavalry battalion, or a cavalry battalion. It is the 1st of the 108th Regiment, which is the battalion of cavalry in this unit. They have the constitutional militia forces, which are like their filler units, but the thing about the Free American Army is they actually train their militia forces. The troops of the Free American Army trained their militia forces, their constitutional militias that they raised up. They trained them in battle tactics and battle drills. So these aren't like totally worthless filler units like the woke militias. Since there's only limited Army forces that defected from the U.S. Armed Forces, mostly Guard and Reservists, they had to use a lot of militias as fillers, or as primary forces. Now, they stretched all the way from the northern end of the battlefield all the way to the very southern part of it here, which is where their primary heavy-hitting forces were. And in the middle, and to the northeast, there are the yellow, which is the forces of the Army of the Southeast, which are largely comprised of militia, hence the M for militia. Now, throughout their campaigns and throughout their amalgamation of forces coming in, they were able to acquire some Abrams tanks and Bradleys and even some artillery pieces, and they were able to amalgamate them into some semblance of a force, 1 battalion roughly of artillery, and there was an armored battalion. It was held back as a reserve force. By reserve, meaning it was held back to be used for an assault at a later time, if necessary. You will notice in these battle maps that not all forces ever get committed fully. There are elements of reserves that are held back, and that can be due to a lack of logistics just as much as it can be due to a tactical development requiring reserves to be held back for use at a later time. The first moves of this battle as the regime advanced up I-16 and met the Free American Army forces advancing from the west, and met the Army of the Southeast advancing into the city itself. Some of the first moves were shelling by all sides, by the artillery of all sides. Due to limited shells being able to be brought up from Fort Stewart, the regime had to be very sparing with their artillery shells fired by their 155 millimeter howitzers, which are a large howitzer artillery pieces, such as the M109 Paladin, like I was on in Iraq, and then there's other towed pieces that they ended up having to put back into service, I'll just say. to be able to fill up the units that had, to make up for what had vacated and joined the other factions, such as how this 48th Infantry Brigade combat team ended up breaking with the regime. So, they all began to open fire on each other's forces. In the north, you had the howitzers of the Army of the Southeast firing on both the regime elements here, as they were trying to seize the airport because the regime was trying to use it as a logistical point, which they had captured relatively quickly with their paramilitary National Security Forces battalions, which are merely just the former alphabet gangs all amalgamated together to form these battalions. These became the National Security Forces, paramilitary forces. They sent them to seize and occupy and hold the airport. But some of the first moves in the battle was that the Army of the Southeast set its sights on the area and began to shell all the forces around the area, trying to hold the municipal airport here. One NSRF battalion quickly tried to reinforce the battle lines here, as about 4 militia battalions of the Army of the Southeast did a direct assault on the forces here, with their artillery supporting them with various types of fire missions, mostly with the HE rounds they were able to acquire, but also with some mine rounds and other types. They had various types of fuses, like point detonation fuses to where it would explode as soon as it hits, but also they had timed fuses for other types of munitions that they were able to acquire. Remember, this is a largely militia-oriented, or heavy, rather, type of force, the Army of the Southeast. So, yes, there are some military amalgamated in with it and equipment, but they're largely just a general militia type of force. There's not a very good standardization of logistics because there's very many different types of forces using different types of ammunition. And I wanted to explain that the militia logistics are often very separate from the military logistics of the military units of the regime or the defected ones of, say, the other factions. They both have different sets of logistics due to the different, the standardization is lacking among the militias, so they generally require their own types of logistical elements, whereas the military forces strictly rely on their old military transport for logistics, like their specific units dedicated to those types of things with the right trucks, and they carry the right ammo, the right shells. Everything is standardized among the military forces, whereas the different types of militia forces, they all carry different types of small arms, and that can cause complications for when you have to bring ammunition forward, and you don't have guys that are firing 5.56 ammo and they need 5.56 and they're firing 7.62. Well, that sort of throws a wrench into operations, doesn't it? Because they're shooting the wrong types of calibers for the, that's just an example of what can complicate or hamper logistics. Standardization of logistics became a very big headache in this internal conflict because of all the different types of ammunition used, because of all the different weapons used among the militia, between the militia and the military forces. I hope people understand that. So, that plays a huge role in this. But, no less, they continued their assault here with artillery support. And while that was going on, the Free American Army forces of the 48th Infantry Brigade Combat Team moved into position here. This artillery force here, this battalion, this first of the 118th Field of the 1st Battalion of the 118th Field Artillery Regiment, moved into position here with the 177th Brigade Support Battalion to bring its shells along with it. See, there's an example of a logistical unit there to provide logistics. They trucked in the ammunition, the shells for the howitzers and everything, all the food, water, everything that this field artillery battalion would need to conduct its missions were trucked in right behind it by this Brigade Support Battalion. So upon setting up position just to the northwest of Macon, they began to fire shells to hit regime forces that were in the southeast part of the city, mostly your woke militias here, while they also hit the army of the southeast, who also had forces in the city, generally in two pockets, because what ended up happening was both the regime punching through and also the constitutional militias punching through to meet each other here. There was a three-way battle. So this group of 5 militias here in the south central part of the city were surrounded on one side by Free American Army forces, and they were surrounded on the other side by regime elements. Now I want to take you here to the southern and southeast part of the city. A large battle was underway here, as mostly the forces in the area that the Free American Army could use were their constitutional militia forces, who moved into position by this militia moving due east and stopping here for a moment, while allowing these 3 forces of militia, these 3 battalion-sized elements, about 3,000, to hit the woke militias right here that had advanced to meet them. Foreign volunteers and Antifa, essentially, in 2 battalions, had attacked them to meet their threat. But what ended up happening was they were defeated, of course, because woke militias are largely combat ineffective units used in human wave assaults. They were repulsed, defeated, and crushed by these 3 constitutional trained militia forces that ended up punching through and advancing deep into the southeastern portion of Macon. Now, when this happened, there was already a battle line established here between this BLM battalion against these 5 militia forces here, these 5 militia battalions, and also this BLM battalion, who ended up holding this line with this foreign volunteer battalion to fight the constitutional militias that had punched up through here. So things were rather complicated in the regime's southwest sector here, because in the southeast corner of Macon, which was to the regime's southwest, the battle had grown even more complicated by the defeat of their forces in the southeast corner of Macon. Now, this battery that had opened fire that I explained in the beginning at these forces that had gathered here had been largely running out of shells by this point and could do very, very little to help, if anything. And this constitutional militia here, upon their breakthrough here of these 3 here, breaking through into the southeast, they swung north and crossed a shallow section of the Okomogi River here, and they punched on through and assaulted the 1st of the 9th, the 1st Battalion of the 9th Field Artillery Regiment, the 1st of the 9th. And they held their position largely as an infantry force, as well as having help from the combat engineers of the Brigade Engineering Battalion here, the 9th Brigade Engineering Battalion, as well as the National Security Forces here in the far southeast, headed north to meet the threat of this battalion of constitutional militia, who ended up fighting very bravely and skillfully and holding the line right here. So essentially the territory went something like this. The Okomogi River, then it sort of went like this, and the new battle line was established here. So on the field of battle, the forces of the Free American Army had made some gains. They had gained some ground and were steadily advancing against both the regime but also against the Southeastern Army militia forces, about 5 battalions of militia that were trapped now, encircled right here in the south central portion of Macon, in these neighborhoods here. So the city was basically on fire by this point. Buildings were being blown to bits, and homes were burnt down and being shot up, and everything was going mad inside the city. Everything. So in this part was where the Army of the Southeast and their forces still held a strong foothold, and they were continuing to fight very strongly against these regime forces here. Now this force of foreign volunteers had retreated, only to be intercepted by this National Security Forces paramilitary force who, at gunpoint, stopped them in their tracks and threatened to shoot their commander for desertion before ending up amalgamating with them into a single cohesive force to aid these forces that were trying to hold back the Free American Army militias right here in the southeastern corner. Now, up here, this National Security Forces battalion had tried to do an attack of its own, and it ended up getting trapped between these forces of Southeastern Army up here, not them who were attacking here, but by these forces here, these battalions here. It was about 4 of them who encircled them, and they were fighting for their lives in the northeast corner of the city. Meanwhile, this brigade support battalion here, the 703rd, had headed to the airport to pick up some supplies that were due to be landed. Food, water, and ammunition that was barely available at the front and desperately needed at the front. Yeah, I could still use the word barely there because it was still true. And they were about to take the supplies and begin to drive along the lines here in the city and resupply all these units. But they would never get the chance, as the artillery was pounding the airport very hard by this point from the Army of the Southeast, who had utterly damaged the runway and many of the buildings where the logistics were beginning to be stored at in decent quantities. They were flown in rapidly from Fort Stewart, Georgia, and its airfield. Also, in other parts of the battle, we had these 3 constitutional militias up here. They had moved to seize the highway here at Interstate 75, just north of Macon. They wanted to be able to control all the entry and exit to the city, and they also wanted to hold positions along the Ocmulgee River here to keep the Army of the Southeast from making a crossing and perhaps performing a flanking maneuver to aid their forces already downtown in the middle of the fighting by crossing the river, swinging around, and potentially trapping these forces fighting them. Artillery was still raining down at this point, as shells now began to hit this National Security Forces battalion that was trapped between these 4 battalions of Army of the Southeast troops. Also, battery fire of the artillery began to hit the constitutional militia forces here, causing them both to abandon their positions but to head further south to hit these Army of the Southeast forces on their flanks here. Also, you had another constitutional militia seizing this part of the highway here at another interstate, 475, to control its entry and exits to the battle space. Because, again, logistics were very critical here. Because you had forces like the 177th Brigade Support Battalion helping to provide shells and food and equipment to the artillery here, as well as others. And you had these forces down here who did the main attack, which you had the headquarters battalion, you had the cavalry battalion, which was largely tanks and Bradleys and such, heavy armor. You had, and these infantry battalions here. And they had another brigade support battalion here who provided their logistical needs, their shells, their bullets, their medical supplies, their food, their water, their fuel, their maintenance, everything. And they all headed into the battle space together, moving up I-75 in the southern part of I-75 here just south of the city to strike at regime forces before moving north to reinforce what was going on in the downtown area and help with the surrounding of these forces here, hopefully to bring that to a close. At the very end of the battle, they actually did. The very last moves of the battle saw whatever remained of these 5 battalions here surrendering to the Army of the South, or I'm sorry, not the Army. They saw the Army of the Southeast's 5 battalions surrendering to the Free American Army here. largely to its 48th Infantry Brigade combat team. So again, the results of the battle was the regime offensive to seize major road junction of Macon was halted. Local regime forces were blunted. The Army of the Southeast poised to seize the airport, while the Free American Army largely cleared all of southern Macon of both regime and Army of the Southeast's forces. It was a tactical victory for the Free American Army, while it was a strategic victory for the Army of the Southeast, which was due mostly to the regime being weakened in coastal Georgia, with also Army of the Southeast forces to be built up for a future offensive against the weakened Free American Army forces after all the fighting they've just done, and the local forces of the regime as well, now both low on manpower and logistics. Overall, the battle was a stalemate. As situation deteriorated and the sides all ran low on logistical capabilities and food and fuel, the forces that remained of the Army of the Southeast were the easiest by far to reinforce with such logistical needs. In other parts of the nation, at the conclusion of the Macon battle being a stalemate, what had happened was the regime forces from the Fort Stewart area that had attacked the Macon here, that were repulsed, had largely been weakened and blunted. So along the coast, there were other Army of the Southeast elements building up to seize both Savannah and the installation, while the regime forces that had gone to Macon had utterly suffered and lost. Also, the Free American Army would not be able to launch any more major offensives to capture Macon, and the Army of the Southeast was likewise stuck in a similar situation. Though it couldn't proceed in Macon, it was a diversionary strategic victory because they were still in place. They still held the major road junction of Macon, largely, in the downtown area, where two highways came together. And they also set themselves up for a possible future offensive to seize Savannah and Fort Stewart and take all of its remaining logistics, facilities for maintenance, and everything else that they would need to keep their forces going. Now, I take you to the next battle. For the next battle, I take you to Jacksonville, Florida, where in the first video, when I talked about the Florida coup occurring against the regime, where Florida became its own independent state, and it tried to seize the resources of Blount Island, the Marine Corps logistical depot, but was repulsed from downtown by numerically superior regime forces, although the numerical superiority didn't translate to actual decent fighting capabilities or arms, because they were a lightly armed paramilitary force largely, along with an amalgamation of pro-regime military forces that were also holding Jacksonville. Before I take you to the battle map, I'll begin to read off the situation. The Battle of Jacksonville occurred from the 2nd of July, when Florida declared its independence, to the 31st of July. July 2nd to July 15th was the initial skirmishing and building up of forces and logistics for the battle, and the siege ensued until the actual battle began. The battle itself, not the siege and the skirmishing and the building up of the forces for the battle, but the actual battle itself, occurred between the 15th and the 31st of July. But only a week later, after the 31st, would be the official final surrender of all regime forces in the area. It was a week later, and the reason why it was a week later is because they intended on continuing to hold out, but their resources, their logistical abilities to defend the area had gotten dangerously low, and they could no longer even hope to defend what remained after the battle just the week prior. So again, the entire battle from the beginning, the build-up, and the siege period and the skirmishing until the end was the 2nd to the 31st. But again, a week after the 31st was the final official regime surrender because they had run out of everything that they needed for their remaining forces that didn't already fall in battle. The total forces involved were 25,000 of the regime's forces, largely paramilitary, but also some military battalions as well, that were an amalgamation of the different services, the different branches of service, such as Marines and Coast Guard and Air Force and Navy, mostly. The Army of the Southeast was present at this battle as well, generally on the north. They contributed 8,000 troops to help their Florida allies, who they wanted to join and become a part of officially. Florida itself, in this particular battle, contributed 24,000 troops. So between the Army of the Southeast and Florida was some 32,000 troops total, 8,000 of the Army of the Southeast, 24,000 of Florida, against 25,000 regime forces. The total casualties are as follows. The regime lost 17,000 troops as casualties, and 8,000 became POWs. The Army of the Southeast, who was a Florida ally, the Army of the Southeast, they lost 3,000 troops as casualties, and 280 as POWs, who were actually freed a week later at the official surrender, but 20 were dead out of that number. So only 260 were ever repatriated. 20 died in regime captivity, mostly executions. As for Florida, they had 5,000 casualties among their forces contributed. They had 1,000 POWs among their forces that were contributed, and of the 1,000 POWs, 200 were found later, a week later, executed. Only 800 were repatriated to Florida forces. By August 7th, 1 week after the battle, and the Army of the Republic of Florida and its allies of some available 8,000 soldiers from the Army of the Southeast, seeking the vital Jacksonville port and base infrastructure, was for its respective forces of both allies. They built up all available forces to capture the city for its economic, military, logistical, and symbolic importance, especially to Florida in particular, as it is Florida's biggest city by population and land size. And I take you now to the battle map. Here is the city of Jacksonville. It looks very familiar to the map I made for the foreign invasion city of Jacksonville battle in the Florida campaign, but this one is for the internal conflict here. As you can see, here's the Atlantic Ocean, the coast. Here's the inlet here, the river, and the lake here. Now, Jacksonville Port is up here in this area here of the city. This is land here. This is the port area here. Now, at I-95 here, in the first part of the documentary, initially what happened was the forces of the Florida Guard sent only 4 battalions to seize both Blount Island. 2 were to seize the resources, logistics at Blount Island, the Marine Corps installation. It was a logistical base for the Marine Corps. And the other 2 battalions were to open up a humanitarian corridor so that people that were already, militias basically, the rioters that became militias and other armed combatants in the cities that were conducting guerrilla warfare against regime forces, they made a corridor by which they could escape the regime. And they did so quasi-successfully, but what occurred was a period of siege. It was a siege. They laid siege to the regime forces in the city, and both sides built up for a large battle. The Army of the Southeast, a dedicated ally of Florida, had joined in the battle as well. They had sent 8,000 of their forces, broken up into 8 different battalions of militia, to the battle. They did have a heavy militia battalion that was comprised of armored vehicles of different types. So again, standardization of parts was a nightmare, but they kept everything running to the best of their ability. And they did have some dedicated mechanics who were vehicle mechanics in the armed forces in their previous stints in the military, because remember, a lot of veterans joined these factions, so they were fairly able to keep these running, and they cannibalized parts when they had to gain certain specific components from another vehicle that weren't available per se, so they had to do that. But they kept most of them running. Now remember, this is early in the internal conflict, so they haven't quite lost a lot of vehicles just yet to maintenance issues. So that is the force composition, primarily, of the Army of the Southeast forces that came to the battle to help their ally Florida. Now, as for the Florida forces, of their forces present, they're comprised of both civilian militias that are pro-Florida militias that serve the new Florida country as militia forces, and also elements of the Florida Guard, such as the 124th Infantry Regiment of the Florida Guard, and also a battalion of artillery, the 3rd of the 116th Field Artillery. Here, it was a HIMARS rocket launcher, rocket artillery battalion, who actually contributed a lot of heavy firepower. They contributed all the heavy firepower, really, to this battle here, saturating parts of the city with rocket fire, heavy rockets. And also, these guard forces here were the infantry forces, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Infantry Battalions in this battle. Now, when the battle began, it initially started, again, with these battalions that had tried to seize Blount Island withdrawing from the battle, establishing themselves, ringing the city, with their Army of the Southeast allies, who contributed their 8,000 to ring the upper part. The regime forces here, inside the city, began their defenses by establishing pockets inside of buildings and setting up barricades in the streets and doing other things to try to block the advance of the soon-to-come forces of the allies of the Army of the Southeast and their Florida allies. The municipal airport here was largely what the regime was trying to use to bring in supplies, but they got very little supplies from anywhere, as the ability to fly in supplies was already very curtailed by a general lack of fuel. Only one time in the entire battle did a supply plane actually land and deliver food and ammunition and water, which was basically all it was able to deliver, was small arms, ammunition, food, and water, before it took off again. Remember, the regime only had 11% of all the fuel available, So their air forces barely flew at all, if any whatsoever. Very rarely did the regime ever use any of its air power, because it couldn't afford to. So when the battle began, the HIMARS battalion here, the 3rd of the 116th, began to saturate the regime areas of the city with rocket fire, raining down the heavy rockets of their HIMARS systems. And as they did that, not only did the Florida militias attack and head into the city, as so, these two here raced in, established themselves right here, driving up a wedge between these regime forces here, while other elements came up from the southwest to flank the regime forces, but they ended up running into heavy regime positions right here. But more forces were available, and more would be fed into the battle by the Florida side, gradually. In the southeastern part of the battle, you already had militia forces and the 3rd Battalion of the 124th here holding the line, which was already their positions during the siege and the buildup of logistics. Logistics were pre-positioned all around the outskirts of the city to be used by both militia and army units alike. The support battalion here did its job during the battle of driving and delivering fuel, ammo, and more food, water and parts, and doing maintenance on the vehicles to this infantry battalion here, the 1st, and also coming over here to the 2nd and doing the same. It would establish position, take care of these forces here. Then it drove over here, established position here in the little circle, took care of these forces of this battalion. Then it moved up and took care of these guys that were holding the line here. And what ended up happening beyond that, beyond all these attacks here, you can see the first attacks happened along this line right here. This is the battle line right here. You can see right here how these things developed. And these forces here, these two militia battalions came in here. These guys up here were held in reserve. They didn't get used, but they were there if they were needed, in case they were needed to be fed into the battle. So that's 2,000 men of the Florida forces held in reserve, 2 militia forces. Up here, what happened was, while all of that was going on in the other areas of the city, you had the heavy militia forces attacking in a southeast direction towards the national security regime forces in this sector. The battle line was along the interstate here that ringed the city. It was I-10 and I-95 that ended up in a ring here around the city. 95 coming up from here, and 10 coming in from the west. So the battle lines were largely at first along the interstates ringing the city here, down in here. As time progressed, these militia forces up here, about 3,000 men, got into a battle with an attacking National Security Forces battalion that was doing a probing attack. They were probing for weaknesses to see if there were any weaknesses in the Army of the Southeast forces. But they were met with a powerful counterattack when these 3 battalions here hit back, utterly annihilated them, and moved on and established position here, securing the entire port area that this probing force was attempting to take back. This force up here swung around and hit regime forces right here that were here, these 2 other battalions, destroying them before advancing all the way here and taking this entire area of downtown. To the west, what had been occurring was this heavy militia unit of the different armored vehicles I had told you about, and these 2 on their flanks, these 2 regular militias to guard their flanks, had attacked southeast and hit the regime forces in this sector particularly hard. And while that was going on, the two different Florida militias here broke out and hit them from the back here. And these forces earlier had already tried to move in to establish a line here, but they had failed because by the time the Army of the Southeast forces came in and established a battlefront here, these forces of the Army of the Southeast were attacking here, and these guys were punching a hole through the lines, going down the streets in the city, engaging all regime elements that they found in the various buildings and the rubble that was left from the city being rocketed by the HIMARS at the very beginning of the battle. The city lay in ruins, as it had been meticulously shelled by rocket artillery from the HIMARS. It had also been all the savage street fighting that pockmarked all the large remaining buildings with huge indentations, and it utterly turned houses into Swiss cheese. Fires raged all across the city from a combination of varying factors. Now, here in the south, the 1st Infantry Battalion here ended up swinging around and establishing a position here, being held in reserve as these militia forces attacked here. And upon retrieving their logistics, getting enough fuel, ammo, food and water for this specific assault, making sure their vehicles were in prime working order, they punched a hole right through the regime lines in this part of the city. They had punched through right there, right here. And they reached the interstate. On reaching the highway, they had basically put these 2 battalions of national security forces into a pocket where they were utterly surrounded, as they then swung around and reached the lake coast here in the city and hit them from all sides. While these militia forces were hitting them from the front, they hit from the back, severed their connections with any hope of retreat or logistical resupply. They surrendered whoever remained alive, not that long afterwards. Up here, these forces, the combination of the Army of the Southeast coming in from the port area, from the north, from the northwest, along with the Florida forces that had tried to punch through here, but ended up punching north instead, where the regime predicted they would come here. They mispredicted, and these Florida forces punched north, engaging the regime forces here in a pocket. This part of the city had been heavily battered already, these regime areas, by the rocket artillery. As you can see, all the dotted dashed lines here are where rocket artillery strikes came in at, in particular. Now down here in the southeast, what happened was forces that had been resupplied recently by the support battalion of the regiment had already punched through right here. The siege forces that besieged the city had already held this line for quite some time. Sporadic fighting had already been occurring between this mixed military unit here and these national security forces, paramilitary forces here, and these militias and this battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the 124th. They had already been engaging them here in sporadic street battles, and they were also being hit with the rocket artillery very, very savagely, which had withered their forces down substantially as they lost valuable men and materiel in the artillery barrages. This militia battalion and the 3rd Infantry Battalion here punched on up through the middle here, reaching a vital highway bridge. The regime forces, this national security forces, this one, and this one, 4 of them gathered themselves together here, and they assaulted, trying to outflank them and hit them from their side flank here, from their northern flank. But they utterly failed because these 2 forces turned and faced them and hit them back and held them off. And thus, they held the bridge. severing any hope of any resupply for whatever forces were scattered remaining in pockets. By about that time, this battalion of Army of the Southeast Militia Forces, about 1,000 men loaded up in small boats and rafts, and under the cover of night crossed the mouth of the river here and landed and captured the Mayport Naval Base. This mixed military unit of largely Navy and airmen tried to return because the forces that were the skeleton crew that held the base were utterly wiped out and were taken prisoner. When this mixed military unit tried to hit back, they were repelled. So now they had a valuable foothold right here on this peninsula on the easternmost part of the city, where they held the Mayport Naval Base. The port, the harbor, had already been captured. The port itself, which is on the northern end of the mouth of the river here. And soon thereafter, the entire western portion of the city surrendered, leaving nothing but a scant few battalions of regime forces trying to hold down this peninsula right here in the easternmost portion of the city on the other side of the river. And thus ends the battle. Only a week later would the regime surrender, and the Army of the Southeast and Florida forces, who were allies, would be horrified to find the atrocities committed by the regime, who always claimed to uphold the Geneva Conventions, but actually in reality did not, finding 20 Army of the Southeast troops executed sometime during that week, and 200 forces captured from Florida executed by the regime also. 220 were dead, but the rest of the POWs repatriated to their respective factions. The results of the battle was that Florida has succeeded in the capture of the city. This created the possibility of Florida expanding critical trade as locally close by farms and other types of economic production capabilities could conduct vital trade, as well as station the victorious forces at the local installations now captured, who very greatly needed a rest and refit. By refit, that means they needed their a refit of their entire units. They needed new vehicles. They needed to rearm, do maintenance all over again, reestablish logistics, everything that a unit has to do before they go back into operations. Replenish the dead or the people that were wounded. Replenish them with fresh troops. That's a refit for an entire unit. They needed to do rest and refit, and the facilities captured at Jacksonville would serve as a big help to this. Although many were badly damaged by all the heavy artillery of the rocket artillery of the HIMARS systems rocketing the city into near oblivion, and all the fighting that occurred inside the city itself, there were still tiny parts of these installations that could still serve some sort of a purpose in those types of endeavors. Now, granted, the fighting that occurred in the port, it required some small repairs to key port facilities, but the port, if done properly, if enough resources were adequately allocated to the cause and the right personnel to do the repairs, the port would take another month or so to get up operational again. It would all depend on how long the war itself would last. Now, we go back to the map. That was the Battle of Jacksonville. The next battle I take you to was a long siege that had occurred here in central Texas. The siege of Fort Hood, which became the Battle of Fort Hood, which was one of the biggest in the entire war. Not so much necessarily due to the personnel numbers involved on both sides, although those were humongous numbers. It was also due to the fact that this is where heavy regime forces with tanks, air defense weapons, artillery, engineers of all types, combat and regular, and various other sorts of units all clashed between each other, both on the Texas side and on the regime side. It was one of the biggest, deadliest battles in the whole war. Though not the biggest and deadliest, it was up there with them. And as far as heavy forces involved, it was definitely up there. I take you now to that map here in just a second. At the Fort Hood battle, the casualties, the total forces involved at the Fort Hood battle was 38,000 regime forces, all very heavily equipped forces. Also, the secessionist Republic of Texas and its army of some 75,000 troops, 75,000, plus 12,000 additional forces that ended up being off the map because the 89th MP Brigade and 3rd ACR, which 3rd ACR is my old unit, I just wanted to put them in here. The 89th MP Brigade and 3rd ACR was sent to debrief because they switched sides. And Texas loved it when people switched sides and joined their side, especially when they brought all their stuff with them. 89th MP Brigade and 3rd ACR were sent to debrief and go on to other missions in other parts of the new Republic of Texas. The battle occurred between July 2nd and July 28th, because you remember around the 1st and 2nd was the time frame to where both Florida and Texas became their own countries and declared independence. They seceded. So there's your Yugoslavia aspect to this whole thing. The secessionist Republic of Texas also had air power in this battle. They used their Hellfire and Maverick missiles to great effect, firing them from their Reaper drones, their MQ Reaper drones, and also from their F-16 squadron of the Texas Air Guard that became the Air Force of Texas, to attack ground targets. They lost 3 drones and 2 jets to air defense artillery missiles from the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigades, Patriot missile systems. They operated the air defense missile systems, the 69th did, and those were air defense artillery systems that were missiles that were made to shoot down everything from high-flying drones to fighter jets and bombers and so on and so forth. They're not the best air defense systems in the world, but they definitely do work in some instances. They've been upgraded in some cases. Yeah, that's basically what happened here. So I take you now to the battle map itself. Now here is Central Texas. You have Killeen, which is the city right outside Fort Hood here in the orange. You have Copper's Cove in the orange. Then you have the base in this light blue color. The base is in the light blue. That's Fort Hood. You have Nolanville, Harker Heights, Killeen, Copper's Cove here. Lampasas is a bit off the map. Lampasas is another town. Then you've got Belton, which is by the Belton Lake right here. You've got, here's Belton Lake. You've got the city of Belton. You got Temple, and up here is Waco. So when the defecting units of the 89th MP Brigade and my old unit, 3rd ACR here, when they defected, 3rd ACR was sent further south to Austin for its debriefing and being sent to another mission elsewhere in the state, so as not to, maybe have some second thoughts about defecting and helping their old regime buddies. The 89th MP Brigade was debriefed in Waco, and sent on to North Texas to help forces up there that were facing down the Free American Army to the north. The forces in Central Texas primarily consisted of, on the Texas side, the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. This is all the 36th Infantry Division, which is it's a huge division. It's called a division, but it's a lot bigger than a division. It's actually more like closer to a corps almost. It's huge. It's got nearly 18,000 in it. It's like 15, 16,000 large, maybe 17,000. It's big. They have their subordinate units of the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team and their subordinate battalions. They have I told you this is a big battle. They have the 36th Support Brigade here, which is all their logistical support units. They transport logistics to all these other units. Then you also have the 36th Artillery Battalion here. Right here, just this right here. These are militia forces that are supposed to be doing security for it and holding the perimeter against the regime. You also have the 72nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team here. Then you've got the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team here. Then you have the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment of the Texas National Guard here. Then you've got the 36th Combat Aviation Brigade that belongs to the 36th ID of Texas Guard. And these are their subordinate units. These are a lot of aviation units, like helo units, like they do have attack helicopters, but they also have aviation infantry and maintenance forces and all that stuff. They're holding the northern side. Now, a lot of the helicopters weren't flying for a different plethora of reasons. Sometimes it was due to fuel constraints. Other times it was due to, because they can't keep them in the air all the time. They have to do a lot of maintenance on them. They have a lot of different things going on. So when they couldn't actually use their helicopters, they used the ground crews and everybody else as a part of the perimeter duty here, where they guarded the perimeter against regime forces breaking out to the north towards Gatesville. Then you have up here you have the 143rd Infantry Regiment, which is actually an airborne unit. It's the only airborne unit in the Guard, and it's in the Texas Guard. So the rest of the airborne units are primarily, besides this one, they're all active duty. But Texas has its own airborne unit, which is pretty cool. They've got artillery, and they have 3 airborne infantry battalions here. Then the rest is militia. Heavy, good old-fashioned Texas militia forces, armed with a whole variety of various types of small arms and everything else. And they're all trying to help the Texas Guard hold the line here to keep the regime forces contained. Now, major battles were fought over the airfield at West Fort Hood, because that was how the regime was getting resupplied. And during the battle, the Texas Guards, most of the use of their air power, which was largely drones, but they did use some of their F-16s. The one time they used their F-16s to really great effect was there was a C-17 flying in, and although the Texas forces in the area didn't have air defense, ground-based air defense, what they did do is they scrambled a pair of F-16s, and they fired a Sidewinder missile, hit all the logistics in mid-flight, destroying the plane in the air, and the remains of it crashed. So they took down one of the regime's key logistical flights of badly needed food and water, which helped to shorten the siege a little bit, or the battle rather, because if Texas had control of the air, how was the regime going to get its supplies? But, remember what I said, the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigade of the regime did manage to shoot down some of Texas forces' drones and fighter jets. So there was a bit of a back and forth between the air defense artillery, which was ground-based that the regime had, and the air units of Texas. Texas did lose a couple fighter jets, and they also lost some drones. But most of the air power in this campaign was very, very, very limited on the Texas side. Even they couldn't afford to have these humongous air campaigns where they did humongous carpet or tactical rather. They didn't have any strategic bombers, but they that they could use. They could only do tactical bombing missions where they would drop only ordnance on specific types of targets. Like they couldn't just fly and drop a whole ton of munitions because these are just like fighter jets. They're multi-role fighter jets. I mean, yeah, they can drop maybe a few 500-pounders like the Mark 84s or some JDAMs or something like that that are like GPS guided free fall munitions, but or drop the paveway laser guided munitions, but beyond that they can't do like any real major carpet munitioning of whole areas. Like they can't do area saturation. They can only hit specific ground targets. But the ground forces wreaked havoc with artillery. The artillery battalion of the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which came with its own artillery battalion, it shelled Fort Hood badly and Killeen. It shelled the entire area badly. But the regime hit back with artillery of its own, coming from its 1st Cav unit. Some of its artillery battalions fired back, belonging to its different subordinate brigades. So they fired back. And largely they fired at the support brigade here because they were trying to go for the Texas logistics, their logistical transport forces, because they didn't want them to resupply all the nearby units. So that was important. You see how important the logistics, targeting logistics was during this battle. They understood that if you take out the enemy logistics, then the enemy won't be able to fight as effectively. What the regime was hoping to do was destroy the Texas Logistical Brigade here so that they could weaken all the local forces that depended on it. And they were hoping for maybe a local offensive to dash to the highway and head down to Austin, which wasn't that far away. It was about an hour away. They were trying to break out, head to Austin, and capture Austin, which was the new Texas capital, and seize it for the regime. Even though at this point it wouldn't make much of a difference because Texas had already nominally declared its independence, so all the Texas people wouldn't have just gone back under regime control because they took Austin. But the regime in their warped minds thought that it would work, but it didn't work anyway. It didn't work either way. But the Texans were ahead of the regime because they did down a critical regime plane coming in, a C-17 Globemaster that was delivering logistics that were badly needed by the forces trying to hold out in Fort Hood. So, in the local areas, what then occurred was the regime did try to fire also some of its shells at the attacking forces here of the 256, namely the engineers here, the combat engineers and the Cav unit, and also do counter battery fire against this artillery battery, which was hitting Fort Hood, Killeen, and also regime forces holding Harker Heights. The city of Harker Heights is right here, and the regime forces had a salient that was going into Harker Heights. It was a salient. They were along the river here. Belton's right here, so they were right across from Belton in a little salient that jutted out into the Texas forces. But what ended up happening was these militia forces coming in from southeast Texas, there was about 7,000 of them. They raced up I-35, the interstate, which was the quickest way to get them where they were going. They raced up I-35, left the highway, and reinforced the lines right here, and fought a massive, massive battle against the forces of the 407th Supply Brigade here. It was the Force Supply Brigade, so this is a big logistical force right here. Or I'm sorry, it was the Force Supply Brigade, Force Security Brigade too. They Supply and Security Brigade. They were fighting them right here, and they hit them very hard. And the airborne forces further up here, trying to block the approach to Waco, they also fired artillery and hit these forces exceptionally hard with their 105 millimeter howitzers, which can be transported by air. They're M119s, so those are lighter howitzers than the 155s, but the 105s can still hit pretty hard if you use them right, if you use them in a concentrated amount, which they did, and they fired on the northern part of this salient that jutted into the lines and weakened these forces here. So this is all of 3 Corps right here, besides the 2 units that defected, the 89th MP and my old unit, 3rd ACR. So then next, what happened was these forces all continued to close in very gradually. They kept pushing and pushing. These forces fired their artillery battalion fired their 155 from their paladins. They had paladins, the self-propelled guns, like what I was on. This is the Cav unit. This is the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment of the Texas Guard. So they fired their Paladin self-propelled howitzers, the 155 howitzers. They were hitting this area very hard. The forces of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team were firing their howitzers, their 155s. They were hitting here. And then you had the other forces. You had this field artillery battalion. It was a whole battalion of field artillery that was off by itself. It was like an independent field artillery battalion. They were shelling this area here, hitting these combat engineers very badly. And then you had these reserves come in from the Lampasas area, and they headed in to press an assault here. So what happened was, little by little, the ring began to close in overall. And regime forces beginning to run low on food, critically needed food and water. They had plenty of ammo, but they were low on food, and armies cannot fight without food. The installation was severely damaged from all the shelling, and also the Hellfire missiles fired from, and Maverick missiles fired from the F-16s and the Reaper drones that hit various key targets on the ground here. They hit command and control centers like communication centers and such, so that inter-unit communication became very difficult from one section to another of the installation. So all in all, after a long siege and build-up period, heavy shelling from both sides, because the regime did fire back, their artillery did return fire in different areas. After a long battle and long siege, as logistics became low for the regime, eventually they finally surrendered. The results are that many thousands of tons of vehicles, munitions, and of course, the very tiny certain logistics that remained, such as spare parts and such, were all captured by the Texas Armed Forces of the new Texas nation, as well as salvageable remaining facilities of the installation, including for maintenance, medical, and railhead for transport by rail, where they can load up their various brigades and regiments on flatbed rail cars. That's where the railhead is at Fort Hood. That's what they do. They load them up and they send them to port at Beaumont to put on ships if they're deploying overseas. So the railhead was captured. The Army hospital, the maintenance facilities that weren't completely blown to shit, they were all captured. And they were now in Texas hands with the rest of the area. Some enemy prisoners of war, which were former regime forces that were captured by Texas, some EPWs, enemy prisoners of war, volunteered to switch sides after the battle. Though most went into POW camps, such as the old World War II internment camp at Mejia, Texas, spelled M-E-X-I-A, Mejia. It was reopened now as a POW camp in Texas for enemies of the Texas Republic. Texas was, they treated their prisoners humanely. Very, very, very rarely did isolated instances of battlefield executions occur, but it was isolated, and it was not something that was condoned or endorsed by the Texas government. They were very humane with their prisoners. They fed them, they took care of them. So the POW camp at Mejia was reopened as the internment camp was reopened as a POW camp in Mejia, to the northwest of the battle space. It was north of Waco, sort of canted off to the west. The battle was concluded, or I'm sorry, it was conducted on July the 20th after a building up period lasting roughly 3 weeks. So the battle started on the 2nd, but it was like a build up, and there was pressure and skirmishes along the battlefront, the battle lines. But after a build up period of 3 weeks of forces and logistics, it led to skirmishing between the forces of Texas and between them and the regime. And between the 2nd and the 20th, with a 1 week long actual battle that concluded on the 28th. So the battle itself was between the 20th and the 28th. So that was when all the heavy fighting took place. The shelling, return shelling, the air power being used to drop munitions and fire missiles and such, both against the regime logistical plane and also some of the ground targets of the regime as well. So the results of the battle was that Texas cleared the entire land of Texas, their entire new nation. It was finally completely cleared of regime forces, entirely cleared of regime forces. So they had liberated their land once and for all. So while all of this was happening, different things had been occurring within the nation itself. Now, the Raza Narc0 State was a faction that dealt narcotics, but they also had weapons dealers within their faction that sold heavy weapons, as China and Russia already had secretly put troops inside the United States as a Trojan horse shock army. They had mostly stayed on their CCP regime properties the entire time of the hostilities, only ever emerging to defend the properties directly if attacked. But news could not be spread, as by this point the nation had been busy ripping itself to shreds. So anyone that wandered too close to their properties was annihilated. But the Raza Narc0 State had dealings with third parties that acted as intermediaries between the Raza Narc0 State and China and Russia directly. One such nation was Venezuela, who also wanted to play a role in helping to destabilize the United States. So China and Russia began to send old and simple weapons to Venezuela, who then in turn sold them. These were like surplus weapons, very basic, very simple weapons, such as different types of rifles and mortars and very simple systems, air defense guns that could be used against massed infantry formations or against some certain light armored vehicles, things like that. Also, they were made as air defense weapons, but they could also be used against ground forces. Simple weapons like that. Some of the weapons that were sold to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front from arms dealers of the Raza Narc0 State. Now, don't get me wrong, there was no love between these two, but the Raza Narc0 State decided to sell weapons to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front because the Raza Narc0 State was taking a lot of flack from the forces of the Mormon State, who were now beginning to encroach on New Mexico, leading into conflict with them. So what occurred, essentially, was while the Raza Narc0 State was fighting the Mormon State, early in the war, before the Mormon State closed the land routes, early in the war, they were sending arms shipments through this neutral area to National Salvation Revolutionary Front territory here, because the National Salvation Revolutionary Front was fighting the Mormon State. The old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Even though they weren't really friends, they just had business dealings. Such weapons that acquired by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front were as so. They had acquired 40 107mm Type 63 rocket artillery pieces, not to be confused with the Type 63 armor personnel carriers, also Chinese. But these were Chinese rocket artillery pieces that were very small and very simple to operate and even produce. But they acquired 40 of them through the arms dealers from the Raza Narc0 State right here. They acquired Also, 15 NJ-230, which are truck-mounted Type 63 rocket artillery pieces. And they also, with that, got 2,000 and 1,000 rockets, respectively, as the truck-mounted version was 130 millimeters, and the towed version was only 107. So the truck-mounted fired bigger rockets. And essentially then what happened there was they acquired a total between the two types of Chinese rocket systems, very simple ones, surplus ones. They acquired 3,000 rockets to go with their 40 107 millimeter Type 63s and their 15 truck-mounted 130 millimeter versions. And they also acquired 20 57 millimeter Type 59 towed air defense artillery pieces and 5 similar Russian-produced 57 millimeter AZP S-60s. And they got, with both of those systems, they got some 20,000 rounds to go with that. Also, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front here acquired early on some 20,000 RPG-7 systems and Type 69 systems, which are basically the Chinese equivalent. It's like literally the same exact thing as an RPG-7, but Chinese made. These are very cheap, very easy to produce weapons that are also, they have huge stocks of that they can easily hawk off a few. I'm talking about China and Russia. They have huge stocks of these, like in the multiple hundreds of thousands. They sent them 20,000. And they also sent them 500 RPD, not RPG, but RPD, and Type 56 light machine guns, which are both the same thing. One's just Russian and the other's Chinese made. They sent them 500 of those systems, which are light machine guns, and they sent them 270,000 rounds of belted 7.62 by 39 ammo. The Raza Narc0 State arms dealers sent that to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. They also sent 50,000 Type CQ, which are basically a Chinese M16 clone. It looks exactly like an M16 minus the hand guard. You know, it's shaped a little different. But with that M16 clone, it came with 1,200,000 rounds, which is basically enough for each one to have a full mag of ammunition. If you divide it, it's like 24 rounds. I mean, a full mag is 30 rounds, but it's like 24 rounds, so it's basically enough 5.56. Now remember, all these factions use American-made types of weapons, and 5.56 is a very common ammo type in the United States anyway, so just for them to get that extra ammo really is just like just a little bit extra to have around, even though they already have way more of it on hand, you know, but that's just something that came with the rifles in the sale. They also got 1,000 W85 Chinese heavy machine guns. The W85 is a 12.7 millimeter or 12.7 by 108 millimeter, whereas our 50 cal is basically 12.7 by 99. So the Chinese and Russian 50 cal is a little bit longer in the casing, so it has more powder in it, so it's got higher muzzle velocity than our 50. So the Chinese sold the Venezuelans to sell to the La Razas. They sold them 1,000 W85 machine guns, the 12.7s. And with that came 50,000 rounds of ammo. Then they also got the Chinese Type 86P hand grenades, about 10,000. They got 50 HN-5A, which are air defense missile systems. They're portable. They're man-held air defense, kind of like our Stinger. They sold them 50 of those, which came with 100 missiles, so enough for there to be 2 missiles per launcher. They sold them 200 Type 67 mortars, which came with 2,082 millimeter mortars. These are 82 millimeter mortars, so they got 2,000 mortars with the 200 Type 67 mortar systems. Then they got, let me see here. Then they have their American weapons, of course, which I've been talking about throughout the entire thing. They have plenty of Claymore mines, M2 machine guns, which are American 50 calibers, 240 Bravos, 240 Charlies, M249s, Mark 19s, which are like belt-fed 40 millimeter grenade launchers. It's sort of like an automatic grenade launcher on a belt. They also have AT4s, quite a decent stock of AT4s. They have javelins, but a very, very tiny stockpile of javelins, after all we gave to Europe. M16s, M4s. These came with all the military units here in the NSRF. So that's all that they have a lot of different American, but they also got the weapons that they bought. Now, what the National Salvation Revolutionary Front did with those weapons was Alfred Motufu here got the weapons. And the bought weapons is what equipped his elite paramilitary death squads that morphed into the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's Jolly Roger Death Brigades, which this is their paramilitary unit's emblem right here. They're separate from the militia forces that comprise most of the fighting forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. These are the most fanatical of all the NSRF forces. They're the paramilitary. They're like a parallel military to all the militias and the core forces, which consist of actual defecting military units that defected to the NSRF, and also the combat veterans that amalgamated to form the core forces. Then you have the paramilitary, the parallel forces to the core, and then you have the militia, which are like the regular, like just cannon fodder type of units, filler units. But essentially, that was what was going on with all of that. And sorry about that, everybody. My phone died on me. But, yeah, I'm going to continue this. I still have a lot more I have to do. I had to shift positions. The next battle I was getting to was a huge battle. As I resume this, yeah, I'm sorry about the technical inconveniences. This uses a lot of battery to do these. This is a lot of work, you guys. This ain't no small task. I had to reshift my position to continue these battles so I could do it on the charger. These are images from the conflict. This is fighting going on in the downtown. You see this knocked out Abrams tank. It was likely knocked out by this tank here, or by somebody firing a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon or more. See the 155 howitzer over there shooting behind a sand berm at the desert battles that occurred in the Southwest. You have people inside of a tall building shooting at another tall building that's been blown out. Of course, you have these urban battle scenes where people use the sewers as supply networks to run food and water and ammo through. And they come up out of the manholes and set up and ambush different forces. There's the Mormon State forces packing up a 18-wheeler to use it as a suicide truck with daisy-chained 155 C4 and other stuff, making a huge blast. And then you see their technicals. Got one of their acolytes here leading the troops, and he's shooting a machine gun from his technical at these technicals off on the other ridge, several miles, or not several miles, I mean like hundreds of meters away, where you can still see them. He's firing a heavy machine gun, like a 50 cal, where he can actually hit them from that distance. Up here, you have the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and their paramilitary Jolly Roger Death Brigade forces, which are death squads. And they roam the countryside looking for regime people or former regime people and regime supporters and other factions that they hate. And they either line them up and eliminate them via firing squad or mass hangings, or the worst ones, like regime officials, they set them on fire. They tie them to stakes and burn them. And other ones that they decide that they'll let live, they hack their limbs off with machetes or with chainsaws or axes, like this guy's about to have happen to him. He could have been a snitch or something like that in the previous land that existed. Here's the table. This guy has a pistol pointed at him to make sure he doesn't move. And these two guys are both holding strings to hold his arm in place while this dude raises his machete up. You can see they've used this table a lot. That brown and black off in the background, that's the mass graves where they bury all their victims. There's a gas can right there. Used it to pour fuel on the tinder there that he's about to light. And this shed over here is just like a typical garden shed, but they use it to store their logistics, like their food, water, maybe some fuel cans, ammo. They got their flag. So this is like one of their bivouac areas or their base camps that they turned into an extermination field, a killing field like in Cambodia. Here's the forces up here fighting on this multiple story building. There's a guy here shooting a AT-4, an anti-tank weapon, crouched down at the window. These are just scenes from the battles, you guys. I just want you to get an idea of what things would look like on the ground in a Syrian-style multi-faction conflict. This is a 155 millimeter 198, an M198 here. You see it fired, its crew here fired a shell off in the distance. See it blasting over the ridge there. Oh yeah, I forgot. In the Mormon State one, they got a mortar. They got a mortar team right here, about to load a mortar. Anyways, the next big battle was the battle that occurred in Chicago. The regime had an island, and the island was called Chicago area, where they controlled the whole entire metro area, including some of the surrounding areas here. Now, in the Chicago battle, it was a humongous campaign wherein the National Salvation Revolutionary Front had managed to use the roads and the rail infrastructure nearby in Indiana to truck in and train on the limited diesel they had for their trains. They used trains to bring in all the new weapons that they just acquired recently from the arms dealers of the Raza Narc0 State. And they put their forces together, and they used the foreign-bought weapons with their gold and silver and other precious metal deposits acquired for the war effort. They bought these weapons and equipped some of their best paramilitary divisions of the Jolly Roger Death Brigades with these foreign-bought weapons. Such would be some of the forces, the main attacking fanatical forces at the Battle of Chicago. The NSRF had begun to secretly build up in the Gary, Indiana area as they moved their forces forward for this epic battle with the regime. They were going to cleanse Chicago of globalism once and for all, and with it the entire Midwest. They were going to remove the globalist regime and any semblance of its power from the Midwest. That was the objective. It would be a key symbolic victory if it could be pulled off. The NSRF brought in 76,500 troops. That was who was present on their side at this battle. Total forces involved. The regime's total forces involved some 43,000. The NSRF had a nasty surprise, however. They had recently raided the Bluegrass, Kentucky Army Depot where the chemical weapons were stored, the VX and sarin nerve agent. There were 4 major chemical weapons stockpiles across the United States, one being at Bluegrass, Kentucky, the other being at Anniston, Maryland, and Dietrich, and yet 2 others, one in Deseret, Utah, and one also in Pueblo, Colorado, at its depot, at its military depot, its Army depot, near Fort Carson, Colorado, and the NORAD area, the Cheyenne Mountain, and also the Air Force Academy out there. But that was a different battle. That was a big battle between the Mormon State and the regime trying to hold on to its positions at NORAD and Fort Carson after Denver had been quickly overrun by Mormon State forces as they moved into the area and took the regime by surprise. But at this Chicago battle, a similar thing was occurring. After the long period of buildup between July 24th and August the 8th, the NSRF put together units with the weapons sold to them by the Raza Narc0 State arms dealers, Russian and Chinese weapons primarily, largely mortars, rocket, and howitzer artillery, and also some anti-tank weapons and some air defense artillery weapons, rifles, and machine guns as well. Generally a lot of small arms, but some light artillery weapons and rocket artillery. And also the American weapons were brought in as well, with the Corps forces bringing in their American-made equipment such as tanks, Bradleys, rocket artillery in the form of HIMARS systems and M270 rocket artillery systems, which the M270 is the tracked artillery system, as well as use of very limited air power, such as a one-time overflight of a lone F-16 that dropped a few 500-pound Mark 84 munitions on the regime. The buildup from July 5th to July 24th erupted after skirmishes of masking. By masking, that means the forces that are there to conceal the buildup. The buildup from July 5th to 24th, the battle erupted after skirmishes of masking militia forces of the NSRF helped to conceal the freshly armed and equipped forces of the new Jolly Roger Death Brigades and their best newly formed 5th Corps Militia Brigade, which was a core element of combat veterans and Army forces amalgamated together with equipment, with military equipment. The Jolly Roger paramilitary forces, however, were equipped with weapons bought from the arms deals with the Raza Narc0 State arms dealers. Mostly basic surplus arms were acquired via middlemen and from being in the form of Latin American nations. The 5th Corps Militia Brigade was an amalgamation of small defecting units from the armed forces and veterans of prior wars, as I've said, and they were equipped with American-made weapons, either stolen or brought with them from defecting units. Now, I take you now to the Battle of Chicago. Now that you've seen imagery from around the conflict, you can get a good idea of what's happening on the ground here. When the Battle of Chicago occurred, these forces had lined up a massive army of militia, the 5th Corps forces here of the Army and Combat Veteran amalgamation, and of course, the Jolly Roger division of the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, which is just the name of their paramilitary forces, Death Brigades. Even though a division is bigger than a brigade, they just call it that. It was their 3rd Jolly Roger Death Brigade, now freshly armed and equipped with the new foreign weapons, anti-tank weapons, machine guns, small arms of all types, hand grenades, Chinese and Russian-made anti-air weapons such as the anti-aircraft machine guns, There were the 57 millimeter variety, which could also be turned and used against infantry forces. 57 millimeter rounds are gigantic. They're huge. They're like I think the biggest actual type of bullet they have. That's used for air defense capabilities as a bullet. They have exploding ammunition essentially. Now they were equipped with these things. And these forces were so ultra-nationalist and so fanatical, they often raced into dangerous situations and endangered themselves, inflicting heavy casualties on their enemies, yelling and screaming in battle, charging their enemies, inflicting humongous casualties, but likewise also taking heavy casualties, as new recruits for their forces had to be drawn from some of the best that the militias of the NSRF had to offer, or some of the best of the core forces that were willing to actually let go of their part of the military forces to send troops to reinforce their Jolly Roger death brigades. But the tactics of the Jolly Roger, they were originally made to be a breakthrough force that would punch massive holes in enemy positions so that the core forces and militias behind them could advance. When the battle began, artillery from the recently moved in 278th, it was a Tennessee Army National Guard unit that became part of the NSRF core forces. It was the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment, which had an artillery battalion in it. And also the 181st Tennessee Field Artillery Regiment here had A battalion, B, and another B battalion, which came from another element. When I read about this B battalion came from a different force, and it was supposed to be like their C battalion. It came and joined in and became part of the 181st here. Now, A and B battery were equipped with 155 millimeter howitzers and began to shell regime positions here. And eventually later, the 155 VX shells would come into play as they were moved up from supply and logistical forces to be used in the battle, coming in by one of the trains. Now this is early in the war, so they were still able to use trains sparingly, but they used them only to bring in forces for very specific offensives, along with their logistics. But along with that came some of the VX shells, but that will be explored toward the end of the battle. But at the beginning, major moves were made by the Jolly Roger's 4th division here. The 4th and the 3rd were both present at this battle, at this large campaign. The 4th Jolly Roger Death Brigade's 4th Division assaulted the regime as regime forces conducted probing attacks. There were various woke militias of Antifa, BLM, foreign volunteers intermixed with them, Greenpeace and NFAC and other types of woke militias, charged at the Jolly Roger Death Brigades but were utterly slaughtered. Even though the regime had an artillery battalion of its, it was the 1st of the 122nd Field Artillery Regiment, which is the 1st battalion of it. It attacked with artillery to support the charging woke militia battalions, but the Jolly Roger Death Brigades battalions belonging to the 4th Jolly Roger Division here, they charged back, and a huge battle erupted right here. All these regular militias here were held in reserve. They were originally to come up behind the breakthrough forces of the Jolly Roger divisions, much like down here where there's core forces and also militia battalions as well. Now, further in the south, what you had here is you have the 3rd Jolly Roger Death Brigade's 3rd Division here, and their battalions, all 8 of them, charged regime forces coming in from the southeast towards Chicago. They headed towards Chicago from the southeast. Now, the regime was hit heavily by artillery in this sector in preparation for the Jolly Roger's attack. So when the Jolly Roger battalions attacked, they split into two groups. There were 8 Jolly Roger subordinate battalions here that attacked these paramilitary National Security Forces battalions here. They utterly surrounded them, attacked, and destroyed them. But as they did that, these forces here of woke militias came in to try to give these 2 entrapped battalions some support. But then they were also parried and destroyed. And this element of 8 Jolly Roger Death Brigade battalions charged against these National Security Forces here. Now, supporting them came this armored cavalry regiment. The 278th had swung down and around, and they joined in with these militias here. You can see how they came down, joined up with this militia force here of regular militias. These weren't the Jolly Roger militias, these were the regular militia forces. They joined these 5 regular militia forces, and they came all the way around the field of battle. And they went up north here. As they headed north, past where these Jolly Roger forces had attacked, these National Security Forces retreated to safety, and they established a line here. These were the National Security Forces that were just here. They retreated from the Jolly Roger Death Brigades that had come in. And now, an assault was being done by the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, and also these forces here. This one that joined these militia forces that also swung up here, hitting from the south. They hit from the south. As this happened, the forces up in downtown Chicago, these National Security battalions, there were 3 of them that were rushed south to, these 3 here were rushed to the south to block the advance of the Jolly Roger, the 278th Tennessee Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the 5 regular militia battalions that were now assaulting from the south. This foreign volunteer battalion right here was already trying to hold the line when their reinforcements came down. Now, in the center, this newly formed Corps Forces Brigade that was an amalgamation of combat vets and regular Army soldiers from the Guard and Reserve with all their equipment, they amalgamated into a single unit called the 5th Corps Brigade here. Now, they launched their assault in the center. Now, what they did was when these woke militias were hit by artillery early on, they retreated, suffering massive casualties. They retreated to the safety of the lines now established here by all these forces coming down, and these retreating forces that moved up. And they all established a defensive line right here to hold off against the advancing NSRF forces that were attacking with heavy artillery of the rocket and howitzer varieties. And they were also now attacking with tanks through the center. If you want a bigger view of the battle, I can pan out here so you can see it. All of these militia forces here were held in reserve, and their objective would be, as soon as Gary was liberated, as the Jolly Roger forces were already fighting in downtown Gary and hitting the southern Chicago lines here, maintained by these forces. The first of the 122nd Battery that was right here had retreated, reestablished a firing point, and began to hit the Jolly Roger forces that were attacking these paramilitary forces of the NSRF. Or I'm not the NSRF, I'm saying the NSRF was attacking these national security paramilitary forces, as well as the 1st of the 170th Infantry Regiment, which was holding the southern corner of the line here. Now, when these woke militias, what remained of them, retreated to this defensive line, this area was being hit extremely hard by this 5th Corps Forces Brigade of American equipment, American forces of former combat vets amalgamated together with reservists and some guardsmen, using stolen American vehicles and equipment raided from armories. They formed this unit, and it was a potent fighting force of the Corps forces, which, as well as these Jolly Roger Death Brigades, which were equipped with the Chinese and Russian weaponry that was acquired through the Raza Narc0 State arms dealers to help destabilize the country. And that it definitely did. It contributed a lot to the destabilization. Now, these forces fought valiantly, the NSRF forces did, and the regime forces were generally in a retreat. They were always retreating to reestablish defensive lines. First it was here, then it was here. Gary was all the way captured by the time the final defensive line of the battle was established here. And what happened next would be horrifying. The final defensive line ended up being here, as you can see. The Jolly Roger Death Brigade forces suffered heavy casualties as they were used as breakthrough forces, while the main attack came from these core forces up the center, and they punched through a massive element of units here and established a offensive attack line right here in the center, where they continued to press forward until they met the defensive line of the enemy here. Now, as Gary was captured and they were pressing into southern Chicago, this artillery unit here moved a third and final time to a position right here to establish itself. It had been out of artillery shells, and now it was to be used as an infantry force because it had no more rounds for its 155 howitzers, its M777 howitzers, which are the newest howitzer, and some of theirs had suffered a breakdown, meaning that it would require repairs and fixing because one of the titanium parts had cracked on some of the howitzers, and they needed new parts, which they could no longer now get because the supply chain was virtually non-existent and military logistics had broken down, and also the fact that Chicago was an island. It was now an island of regime holdings. Flights to and from were very difficult as they had to fly over hostile territory just to deliver goods and logistical capabilities, food, water, fuel, ammo, and supplies and parts for vehicles and weapon systems. They were no longer easily getting in, as NSRF, when they operated their fighter jets, they did shoot down a few of these regime logistical flights, which were very few and far between, and the fact that they were being downed so easily made it impossible to resupply forces. So with what limited ammo, fuel, parts, and everything they had left, they were being pushed further and further north into Chicago by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces, who finally launched a VX nerve gas attack by their artillery forces. And they gassed a lot of the forces holding the defensive line. And also many civilians in the city suffered death by the nerve agents, VX and both sarin shells also. Sarin and VX shells were used. Many civilians in southern Chicago died that day, along with the regime's hope of ever being able to hold Chicago, because now most of their forces in Chicago were deceased. As the nerve agents cleared on the battlefield, the NSRF forces moved in even further. But they would continue to fight a little bit north as they advanced into the city. They would have to fight small skirmishes of urban warfare. It was a NSRF victory, to be certain, but the NSRF suffered heavy casualties, but it was a major symbolic victory for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. Of the 76,500 total forces of the NSRF and the 43,000 total forces of the regime, the total casualty count is this. 27,000 of the NSRF forces died that day or were wounded beyond saving. 27,000 were the NSRF casualties. Only 120 were taken POWs. Only 120. The regime suffered even higher casualties. At 34,000 regime forces crushed, defeated, dead, many of them by nerve gas, but mostly it was the civilians that suffered from the nerve gas because the city was a city, and to use nerve agents inside of a city, you're going to kill hundreds of thousands. The regime POWs captured numbered 390. So all in all, the regime lost nearly 3/4 of its forces, as very few remained to establish any sort of a defensive line to hold the city. So at the end of the battle, it was a major, major victory for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. But as they pushed forward, their supply lines began to get strained as they pushed further and further into the city. And the advance began to deteriorate into a series of small skirmishes and battles for street corners and buildings, and it ended up being a small engagement where sporadic artillery and sporadic mortars and rockets and howitzer artillery was continuing to be used. They had used all their nerve agents, and they ended up killing most of the regime forces, but also inflicting several 100,000 civilian casualties in the process who lived in the cities in the metro area. As they had more nerve agent shells, but they couldn't bring them in because the supply lines got too strained, and the NSRF had other battles elsewhere that it had to focus on. In these situations, in an internal conflict, the commanders had to deal with many different fronts and many different battles, so they had to budget. They had to budget logistics accordingly, logistics and troops accordingly. So they had to move things according to the situation on the ground and how it developed. Things were very fluid during these times, so situations changed to where commanders saw areas where they felt they could do a breakthrough, or they saw a strategic city they felt they needed to capture for whatever reason, or they saw infrastructure that needed to be captured or taken. And the next battle has a lot to do with infrastructure, because the next battle originates with the battle for Hoover Dam. And it is the first battle of the Hoover Dam and also the Battle of Las Vegas. The air base at Nellis had been recently captured to the northwest of Vegas. It had recently been captured by Free American Army forces at the just north of Vegas, where they established their base and they had air power there. Now the regime ended up using a little bit of their air power at this battle. They were able to use 4 Navy F-18s on July the 22nd. But before I go into that, I'm going to explain the battle situation. The battle occurred between July 21st and August the 5th. This was the first battle of the Hoover Dam and the city of Las Vegas. The second battle of the Hoover Dam was just over the Hoover Dam, as Las Vegas was largely it had largely become an area that was occupied by the Union of Southwest Militias, and also there were Free American Army forces still there too, embroiled in a stalemate, as well as a tiny element of Mormon State forces that broke in and continued to terrorize the other forces and the civilians by sending in suicide vehicles to cause chaos and even more pandemonium and add to the conflict there. But the forces involved in this Vegas and Hoover Dam battle it was a 4-way battle that involved some 22,000 regime forces. It involved some 15,000 Union of Southwest militia forces. It involved also some 20,000 Free American Army forces, and of the Mormon State, there were present some 3,000 forces from their 8,000-strong Brigham Young Brigade, their original unit that helped them seize control of the Mormon Church in their church coup, and also this whole state of Utah at the very beginning in the first video of this series. The Brigham Young Brigade had been redeployed to their little easternmost sliver of Nevada that they controlled, from above Lake Mead all the way to the frontiers of Idaho. the Mormon State controlled a small sliver of Nevada that they were able to advance a little bit into, but due to the hostile terrain and the being that it was the Great Basin Desert and the Mojave Deserts, logistics became hampered in that region, so they had to stick to a few large roads that they could use, and they could to resupply themselves. And they could only deploy their forces in very small amounts, in very limited amounts. So the Mormon State, in this particular area, only sent 3 battalions of its 8,000-man strong Brigham Young Brigade, which had a total of 8 battalions, but only 3 were sent into this battle. Now, the total casualties of the battle are as such. The regime, 10,500, with 1,500 taken POW by the other factions. The Union of Southwest Militia lost 3,000 and 750 taken POW. 3,000 dead, 750 POWs of their forces that were captured. The Free American Army lost 3,500, so 3,500 deceased or mortally wounded, and 500 taken POW. The Mormon State lost 450, but no POWs, because they fight to the very last, of course. And in the battle, the air power was as so. The 4 Navy F-18s that were used on July 22nd, and they came in from California. And they were for regime air support against the Free American Army and against the Union of Southwest Militias. The 4 used dropped some Mark 84 free fall munitions, 500 pounders, and they also fired the AGM-84E, which was a air-to-land cruise missile, like an air-to-surface missile. It was basically a cruise missile of short range. And they fired that at some tactical targets, such as artillery and other things being used by the factions, like big vehicles or certain positions. And the regime used their air support to moderate effect, but it wasn't enough. Because the Free American Army, they had their F-35s, which are garbage, but they still had them because that was what was taken at Nellis, along with the crews that defected to the Free American Army. They used their F-35s the best they could. They used a pair of them, just 2, in the battle on August 1st, whereas the regime used their 4 fighters, or 4 F-18s, on July the 22nd. So the Free American Army used theirs on the 1st of August, and but one of them crashed due to an accident close to Nellis because there was a malfunction in the aircraft. So only one of them made it back to base. But they did manage to use 4 Maverick missiles against regime targets. And they used their nose cannons to strafe. And they also strafed a couple Union of Southwest Militia Forces battalions as well. They used also a JDAM, which is a direct support or direct attack munition, which is a satellite-guided munition, which is a bomb that can sort of like glide into a target. But that's all that they were able to use as far as air power. Now I take you to the battle map itself. Now here we have the city of Las Vegas, right here. And you can see the different forces arrayed. You can see that up here near Nellis, you can see that there's Free American Army forces up here, mainly consisting of the Nevada 17th Sustainment Brigade, as well as the 1st Battalion, or the 1st Squadron, I'm sorry, the 1st Squadron, because it's cavalry, of the 221st Cavalry Regiment, also of the Nevada National Guard. Then you have Constitutional Militia to their south, right there. It was trying to hold itself against Union of Southwest Militia Battalion attacking them from the south before it decided to head into the city toward other friendly forces to establish a defensive line here against the same constitutional militia that then reoriented its fighting here. But most of the forces were military or constitutional militia, just like in the Macon battle. Now down here was where the big action was going on to capture the Hoover Dam. The regime was clinging on to Hoover Dam for dear life because they were sending the immense power generated back to California because they wanted to reward California for being a loyal area to the globalist regime. Plus, there's a lot of bases, installations that need power in California as well. But they also wanted to reward it for its loyalty to the regime. So they were redirecting power straight to California. And the Union of Southwest Militias wanted the dam to redirect power across Arizona and Nevada only so that they could stop a lot of the brownouts there from occurring because there were rotating brownouts. It was a third world situation because the country was tearing itself to pieces. So what few power plants did run in certain areas, they had to be taken care of by dedicated maintenance crews and engineers and everybody that would come to work, technicians, the manual labor type menial stuff too, because they had to repair things. The repair people. There was a lot that went into this. This is a very detailed situation in all aspects, economic, logistical, militarily, and otherwise. I'm trying to show the full picture of the types of things that happen when nations rip themselves to pieces. The city of Vegas originally began with rioting between various types of rioters. You had woke rioters, and you also had conservative rioters that used to be what you would call Republicans, but then they wanted to clamp down on the woke people, and there was just all kinds of general bedlam and chaos and mayhem going on in Vegas. But then when the Free American Army came to be a faction, and the Union of Southwestern Militias became a faction, and the regime tried to fly in to quash the revolts and the riots, hardcore battles broke out. Because remember, in the Northwest, forces from the Oregon Guard were trying to be flown down, but they had to do a layover in Reno because, and they ended up getting into a battle there and lost and had their cannons taken and used by the Union of Southwest Militias. But the field artillery brigade that was being sent here was going to be used on riot suppression duties. And they even sent their howitzers because the regime contemplated giving them live ammo to shell the city if the rioting got too bad because Vegas was out of control. Now, the Union of Southwest Militias moved in small at first early on, but then they started to accumulate forces to the south of the city and even to the north of the city. And you had other things going on, like you had from the base up here, Nellis Air Force Base, you had the Free American Army coming in to seize control of the city. Originally, Todd Ellison, the leader of the Union of Southwest Militias, he wanted them to just fight each other. He wanted the regime and the Free American Army to fight each other over Vegas. But then he saw the importance of control of the Hoover Dam for his faction's area. So when the battle began, there was a sliver of territory over here along the Colorado River that belonged to constitutional militias that held it, that were separating the not only the regime from the other Union of Southwest Militias in Arizona, but they were separating the Union of Southwest Militias in Arizona from their other forces here in Nevada. So this is a very, very complicated, detailed map. Now up here, where I explained earlier, was parts of the Brigham Young Brigade, of the Mormon State. Now you can see, this is their unit here. It is the Brigham Young Brigade here, in parentheses, and these are 3 of its subordinate battalions, 3 out of 8 of them. Only 3 of them were present, but they belonged to this brigade. And they were in this little sliver of territory that ran all the way up. This is part of Nevada, but they moved in from Utah, from western Utah. And they began by assaulting Union of Southwest Militia forces here on the very edge of Lake Mead. One of their battalions engaged a Union of Southwest Militias battalion and conducted things such as these types of attacks here with these types of weapons, these suicide trucks. Also with their technicals and other types of suicide vehicles. Now remember, they had a huge, gargantuan stockpile of munitions at the Thule Army Depot because they hold a lot of ordnance there, either to be decommissioned or to be worked on and repaired or to be tested. There's huge stockpiles of munitions, and when it fell into the Mormon State, it was like they hit the jackpot when it comes to munitions. And they use them to great effect with their foreign fighters as well as their fanatical domestic fighters of their Joseph Smith Zone units, which were former military units that were loyal to the Mormon State. They were the best of the Mormon State's fighting forces, as were the Brigham Young Brigades, but the foreign volunteers over time began to prove themselves in combat as well. They came from Brazil, Philippines, Mexico, and generally all other nations with large Mormon populations. They answered the call and they came to the Mormon State. And that would play a huge role in the eastern campaigns of the Mormon State when they were taking control of Colorado and New Mexico, which will be explored later. But as for this battle, it was a huge four-way battle, as you can see. Now, momentarily, I'm going to show the map again for a zoom out of this whole area. 1 second. Now, on the map here, you can see the territory. Right here by Tucson and Fort Huachuca, they took Phoenix area and all the major metro areas, and this is the Free American Army here. And then they had constitutional militias that lived along the Colorado that all raised up, close to Yuma and other areas, and they came in here. And they tried to take the dam from the east at first, which is why this sliver's even here. Then the Ellis and Vegas area here, you have a lot of control of the Free American Army and their air base that they now control, and their forces that are now based there, of their constitutional militia and their land forces, like the Nevada Guard units that defected and everything else. Now they're all fighting here, and the Mormon State is right here. They took their sliver of territory along the Lake Mead, and they started to send in their vehicles at first to probe, like their technicals and their suicide vehicles, and then they started to send in their light artillery, like their mortars, and they began to mortar enemies. And then that takes us back here to the battle. So, in the battle, you had the sliver that was right here, along the east bank of the Colorado. And here's the road that goes to the dam here. And there's the dam. You had the regime holding a very tedious, position right here. It was tedious for them because they had to, make sure that everything was in proper order, everything was in line as far as getting logistics. They had to store a lot of their logistics inside the dam itself because they knew that nobody would hit the dam because everybody wanted to capture it. So the regime stored its logistics very carefully in here, and they reinforced their lines here. Their lines on the east side of the dam consisted of a foreign volunteer battalion, which were the refugees that they gave weapons to, basically. Also the regime's infantry battalion coming from this unit here, the 79th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which is out of California. It's a California Guard unit, so they're loyal to the regime all the way. They have their battalions, or they have their Brigades Artillery Battalion, they have their Brigades Cavalry Battalion, and then they have their Brigades Combat Engineers up here, and then they have their Brigades Support, which is their logistical battalion, which would run the logistics around the forces here, keep them all supplied, crossing the dam, picking stuff up at the dam, giving it to these guys, and coming back and giving it to these guys. But all the while, there were former veterans that knew how to operate the HIMARS system. And they comprised a HIMARS militia battalion. And these are former veterans that know how to operate the HIMARS rocket artillery system. So, with the constitutional militias, they now had a HIMAR unit, and they began to rain rockets on regime targets. They hit the 79th California Guard here on the west side of the Colorado, trying to hold the dam. And they also hit forces here in Boulder City. Boulder City had a railhead that the regime was trying to control to bring in certain logistics. The National Security Forces Battalion here and the BLM Battalion here went up to reinforce this National Security Forces Battalion, because what happened here, I'm going to go clockwise, or counterclockwise rather. What you had was this 1st Battalion of the Brigham Young Brigade of the Mormon State attacking this Army, or Union of Southwestern Militias Battalion. They destroyed and defeated them instantly because it was like an ambush guerrilla-style assault. So they attacked them, defeating them. Sorry, guys, I have to shift. I'm like on the floor because I have to charge this, and it's really hard. Yeah, but they defeated them. Then the Mormon State bypassed all these other battalions, and they snuck into the city and established themselves right here. This one battalion did, the 1st Battalion of the Brigham Young Brigades. And they proceeded to attack this Greenpeace woke militia right here. They assaulted this Greenpeace woke militia that, you know, is a regime element. And it was a battalion of Greenpeace people that the regime armed because of their manpower shortage, of course. And these Brigham Young militants destroyed them in battle. They utterly annihilated them. And they held their position in this part of the city. So this became the Mormon State sector of the city, adjacent to this railroad. And that became a huge problem for the regime who occupied Boulder City and the dam, because now that the Mormon State held this part of the railroad, they could attack any sort of rail traffic. So these units guarding the rails here in the city were pretty much worthless at that point, because there was nothing they can do. As far as southbound rail traffic, like logistics, and the regime had little fuel for trains, so you have to understand, their trains had to travel through very hostile territory, and a lot of times they got seized. But it was a desperate move by the regime because they were losing their airport here, which they primarily relied on in Boulder City and Henderson. The Henderson airport was what they relied on for supplies, but little by little it began to be rocketed by this HIMARS battalion all the way over here. So it was rocketing Boulder City, utterly crippling everything, as well as rocketing these California National Guard forces here that were actually holding the dam on behest of the regime. So the forces here were under immense assault from the Free American Armed Forces, both the constitutional militia forces as well as this aviation regiment here, the 285th Aviation Regiment, the 98th Regiment of the 285th. So they had their 2nd Battalion, which was an attack helicopter battalion, that flew up here, attacked this artillery with their rocket pods and with their chain guns, as well as this other one here doing the same. They flew up here, they hit this artillery battalion with rockets because they had just enough fuel acquired, and then they flew back to their starting positions, both here, hold on, the lighting's bad, both here and here. So they started here and here. They both flew at the same time, hit this regime artillery battalion belonging to this California Guard Brigade here, this infantry brigade combat team, which was already doing some shelling, which before the attack helicopters hit it, it had been shelling other forces belonging to the Free American Army, such as the 1st Battalion of the 158th Infantry Regiment here, right here, and it was also shelling this constitutional militia here, and it was shelling, trying to hit the aviation battalion, but it was just out of range. The howitzers were just out of range. So by the time these two battalions flew and hit the artillery pieces with rocket pods and chain guns, utterly crippling most of the howitzers, they flew back to their starting positions and wouldn't be used again because they were out of fuel. By this point in time, some of their helicopters had been shot up by crew serve weapons on their missions to attack, because a lot of these troops up here had machine guns and such. They shot a lot of holes in a lot of helicopters. They downed a few of them, but the few that made it back, they wouldn't be able to be used again because they were in horrible need of maintenance and patching up. Some of them couldn't be flown again at all because they were too dangerous to fly. So the crews bailed from their helicopters and just established defensive positions belonging to this aviation regiment here. Now, the constitutional militia attacked right here with this infantry battalion here. It was the 1st Battalion of the 158th Infantry Regiment. They also attacked right here. They attacked the cav unit right here. And these guys helped. These guys came up as a flanking maneuver to help, so they'd have to watch 2 different flanks. What happened was the foreign volunteers retreated. They didn't even fight. They ran. They're undisciplined. They had no backbone because there were no paramilitary national security forces or military forces there to back them. So they retreated from these better trained constitutional militia forces and the infantry forces attacking the cav. Now, when these infantry forces from this infantry battalion attacked the cav battalion, they came and attacked with tow missiles, a couple javelins, and Mark 19 belt-fed grenade launchers and other weapons like that. Now, they did manage to take out some of their armor, but they did fight back, and they sort of held their line decently well, because they did fight back with their Abrams tanks and their Bradleys. So, casualties were pretty heavy on both sides here. But the rocket artillery that was coming in from the HIMARS was doing immense damage to these pockets and utterly destroying the airport, the railhead here in Henderson and Boulder City. It was very withering firepower coming from this HIMARS that was there to support these units here. Now, the artillery was gone from this unit, because remember, the helicopters did their damage, destroying their artillery pieces and killing a lot of the crews, so the rest of the crews had to become infantry, essentially. Now, down here, you had constitutional militia coming up the highway. Now, they ended up getting into a battle with Union of Southwest militias who took position here, and these 2 constitutional militias hit them on the road. There was a battle along the road there. Now, what ended up happening was they both broke contact. Now, when you say break contact, it means that both sides mutually break off the battle. Like, they both retreat, shoot at each other, whatever. Like, that's called breaking contact. They both go their own separate ways. These 2 constitutional militias come here. You see how they break off their attack and head this way to help their guys over here. Well, when these guys broke off their attack, they came up this way and established a position here, like they're going to get ready to hit Boulder City and Henderson. Now, down here, there were more militia forces from the Union of Southwest Militias. Now, this one moved into position here. These over here captured Sloan, the whole Sloan area. Sloan's a little town here. They captured the whole Sloan area here. They all moved in and established a line along Interstate 15. They captured the interstate to block any sort of logistics from any other types of forces. Because remember, the regime in California was all the way down here. They were trying to block this from any regime reinforcements getting to the city to help their people in the city, or whoever was going to come up that highway and rail system. They were trying to block it. So they seized control of Interstate 15. While these forces came up to possibly they set position here so they could either assist these guys if somebody came up the road, like a column of regime forces, or to fight these guys here in southern Vegas. So what happened now was in the battle in southern Vegas, these guys moved in. After this national security forces attacked this unit holding southern Vegas, this battalion of Union of Southwest Militias, they attacked it. They broke contact because these guys were in strong positions. They were in a rock quarry, and they were in some homes and surrounding neighborhoods and other areas that are in southern Vegas here. It was like a mixed industrial and urban area because there's some rock quarries and sand places here in Vegas. I've been to Vegas, so I've seen them. Now, anyway, they broke contact among these forces holding the mixed industrial and housing area here in southern Vegas. And then when they did that, as they broke contact from these, they came down and they were hit by these guys. So they were locked into a struggle between these forces in the city and these forces that came up there to meet them, and these guys holding a position here. So they were about to be surrounded and cut off from anything. So in the northwest, these forces here, again, as they came in to attack the city from the western side, coming from Nellis up here, these Free American Army forces were attacking in a general, west, from a west-northwest direction to head east-southeast. Well, they ran into regime pockets of paramilitary here inside the city, holding areas of North Vegas, and they're highly urban areas, like big, apartment buildings and mixed housing buildings and developments in the western part, like Summerlin and all those types of places in the west. Now, these are more upscale housing areas here where they were fighting, and like suburban housing neighborhoods, stuff like that, like developments and things. Well, they were fighting in this area of Summerlin and all these nice homes and everything. And they were fighting the regime there, but also from downtown Vegas, right here, Antifa got into a battle, an Antifa battalion, one of the woke militias that the regime has to use due to manpower shortages. They got into a battle with a Union of Southwest Militia battalion who established a perimeter, a defensive perimeter, and they fought them, but were defeated. And then they were also fighting these regime forces who developed their own defensive perimeter. So these regime paramilitary battalion here, this battalion of regime paramilitary, the NSF, the National Security Forces, which were former alphabet gangs that were all amalgamated into one. Well, they were fighting them from these military forces that defected. They were now part of the Free American Army. They were fighting them. Union of Southwest Militias was fighting them. Now, this force out here that came up here that fought their constitutional militia, when they broke contact and restarted contact, that was still going on, what I explained near the beginning of the video. So that was still going on by this point. There was just firefights everywhere, all throughout the map, all throughout the battle. The Mormon State was continuing to send suicide trucks and hit all these different areas and hit different factions. Now, up here was a unique situation along Lake Mead, just north of the dam. What you had was Union of Southwest Militias. You had two of their battalions here, and here. They came down to do battle to break through to get to the dam from the north. See, the Hoover Dam being right here, or I'm sorry, right here. This is the Hoover Dam. So they were trying to break through all these regime elements to get to the Hoover Dam from the north. Sort of like how the Free American Army was coming from the south and from the east here. Now, the lines that were established here, this constitutional militia force crushed this battalion here. All right, I'm sorry about that. My phone died again. I have the cord, but I'm going to finish this, and then I'm going to end this. I still have some battles left for a fourth video, and I have more of the economic stuff to explain, more on the atrocities. But before I end this, I'm going to finish this battle before my phone dies again. Anyways, what happened here was these Union of Southwest Militia forces here had technicals that had their own homemade mortars on them. They were called the barracks busters, like what the IRA used in England, as explained in my first story. Now, these trucks, these technicals here, with these mortars in the back, they lobbed mortars into the city, which were homemade mortars made out of canisters of their own homemade brew, I'll just call it. Well, they fired those into the city, and they hit this National Security Forces paramilitary battalion, who ended up coming up here and doing a hook to try to reinforce these elements holding East Vegas. And while all that was going on, these forces up here destroyed this battalion here of National Security Forces before both advancing this way and this way. And a battlefront was established where this one broke through, defeating this Antifa battalion of woke militia before heading this way to flank this National Security Forces battalion from its right flank, as this other battalion broke through and hit from the front. So they were being hit from two sides coming in like that. And they called for help, so this BLM woke militia came up to reinforce their lines here. But what ended up happening was they were both defeated. They were both crushed. So by the end of the battle, these two battalions, even though they took some casualties, they captured the area just north of the highway here going to the dam. They captured all the area along Lade just north of the dam, minus the tiny pocket that the regime controlled there by the dam itself. Now to the south, remember, these Free American Army forces had been putting a lot of pressure on the regime here by the dam. And along the other side, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were a total of 5 attacking infantry type battalions of constitutional militia with infantry training, and then there was this HIMARS artillery battalion that provided the rocket artillery support that badly wore down regime forces, as they mostly directed the rocket fire onto the regime 79th California Guard infantry brigade combat team that held the dam, and they tried to hit its logistical battalion the most, so that they could wither it down. But what they didn't know is that the regime had logistics inside the dam. They packed the dam full of logistics, food, water, ammo, everything they needed to hold the dam. Massive damage was being done, though. As the battle progressed, the city got more and more ripped apart. All the casinos that people used to visit and gamble in were now used as sniping perches, or they were blown out with mortars and rocket artillery and howitzer artillery. The city was in shambles. And when the Navy did launch its, on behest of the regime, when the Navy was able to use its 4 F-18s, they did manage to drop and fire some missiles that did immense damage to the Free American Army forces that were assaulting the dam right here and right here, to take some of the pressure off of these regime elements that were trying to hold the dam against attack. Now, when the forces attacked from Nellis, the 2 F-35s, they flew sorties, the 2 F-35s did, they flew sorties and hit back at the regime and pummeled them with some air-to-ground munitions and some nose cannon fire, as I read earlier. And then they flew back to Nellis, a short distance away, so they didn't have to use too much fuel to get there. But one of them crashed. It malfunctioned and crashed in an accident, killing the pilot, while the other F-35 made it safely back to Nellis. So this was a humongous battle, and I'm going to end it with reading the casualties and the results. And then I'm going to end the stream, because it's been a long stream, and it's been quite a long documentary series of the battle maps, so I can give people an idea of what these types of things look like on a tactical level, or strategic level rather, with the maps, and also a more tactical level by showing what it looks like in the artwork here, where you have the mixed units, and they're stolen vehicles, like their tanks, their Abrams tanks, and their forces fighting each other, defecting military mixed with militias, and it's just a madhouse. It's crazy. It's crazy. Arms bought from foreign countries, further destabilizing things, and of course you got the Mormon State doing horrible things like this. Loading up an 18-wheeler with ordnance, wiring it all together to blow, making humongous craters across the cities and land. Mortars and artillery howitzers. There's a cannon crew there, behind a berm, firing their 155. Off in the distance, you can see the blast. Here's what it's like inside of buildings in the cities. And the atrocities in the field committed by NSRF's National Salvation Revolutionary Front's paramilitary Jolly Roger Death Brigades here. The type of atrocities they commit against their enemies. But when the battle concluded, this is what occurred. At the end of the battle, of the 22,000 regime forces, the 15,000 Southwest Militia Forces, Union of Southwest Militia Forces, the 20,000 Free American Army Forces, and the 3,000 Mormon State Forces, and 2 of their battalions were held in reserve and not yet used. Just one, the 1st Battalion. The total casualties come to the regime lost 10,500 of their 22,000, plus 1,500 taken prisoner, POWs. So all in all, in actuality, it's a total of 12,000, but I read the POWs and casualties separate. The Union of Southwest Militias lost 3,750 taken prisoner as POWs. The Free American Army lost 3,500 and 500 taken POWs by the different factions. And the Mormon State lost 450 with no POWs taken, of course, because they fight to the bitter end and they do horrible things with munitions. The results of the battle, essentially, were that the regime lost Nellis Air Force Base, although it retains fragile control over the Hoover Dam and small parts of Las Vegas itself. Vegas was split 4 ways. All sides were locked into a brutal urban combat situation. The sides look for ways to stay supplied and build up for a future battle. The regime is barely supplied via the Boulder City and Henderson Airport, local airport, municipal airport. And that set the things up, that set the stage for another future battle for the Hoover Dam, as all sides at the battle maneuvered themselves into position and began to build up their supplies, logistics, and get their battle lines in order, and set up their forces, and gather intelligence, and make sure that they had a way to resupply and refit units that had lost people. And the battle here occurred again from July 21st to August the 5th. So this was about midway almost into the Civil War by August. So in the next battle that I will do in the next video, there's 5 left. There's 5 left. So that's going to be a long video because I have to do the more on the economic situation and the impact. I have to talk about atrocities, and then I got to talk about navigating through all this stuff. So that's going to be a very long final video, and talk more about the leaders in it too. It's just going to be very comprehensive like this was. So you all be blessed. I hope this helped build your understanding and help you to realize what these things are like, and so that you can make better plans for your own preparedness to survive such a situation. This is a hypothetical scenario, but it's based off of real facts, figures, numbers, stats, capabilities, forces, and more. You know, the forces being the military units that I put into it, and I also use the different types of militias that could be comprised out of amalgamations of different sorts of forces and everything else. So, anyways, and then the equipment that I mentioned as well that could equip some of these forces. But I will continue in the next video with even more. So you all be blessed. You have a great night. And I'm going to add this to my whole entire playlist so that you all can actually watch it or listen to it as the whole way through as a playlist. This will be the 3rd one. So the 4th one will be the final one. So you all be blessed. And thank you for coming.